All right. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. This is David Patrick Harry with Church of the Eternal Logos, and I am joined by author, filmmaker extraordinaire, John Hammond. How you doing today, sir?
Great to be here again. Thank you, Patrick.
Well, I appreciate you being here. Today, we're going to be talking about, last time we were here, we were talking about your documentary, American Orthodox, and the life of Father Seraphim Rose from one of your books. And really, we kind of hit on the other two. Today, another one of your books, but kind of going into a different direction. Today, we're going to be talking about the beloved disciple, guardian of the Holy Virgin. And really, I would like for you to kind of introduce to everybody what this book is about, because it definitely has a different direction and flavor than the other three, which are more focused on America. But it's kind of covering the relationship of the beloved disciple, St. John the theologian, and of course, the Holy Theotokos. What is this book about, John?
Okay, well, first of all, my name, John, is based on my patron saint, who is John the theologian or the disciple or the apostle, also known as a beloved disciple. Um, and so that's why I wrote this book, is because when I became Orthodox, when I came to the church, 8 years ago, basically, I needed to find a patron saint. I didn't even know what that was earlier, growing up. But when I discovered, the idea that if you have a saint that you can speak out, or that maybe actually seeks you, and you can use that as somebody who's like a spiritual father on a spiritual plane, and somebody who can give you guidance, and someone who you can sort of dedicate yourself to on some level. So that's who Saint John is to me personally. And reason why also is because growing up, I did read the Bible, and I actually went cover to cover, with it many times over the years, especially as I got more into Christianity. And then especially out of the whole Bible, I would say that the Gospel of St. John was the one part that I would read over and over and over again. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with
Yep.
God, and the Word was God. And that whole incarnation, and just the flowery spiritual multi-level depth of that, became very important to me. So that was the main focus. And then when I looked at his life, which I hadn't even, as many times as I'd read the Bible, it doesn't really go into his life. It basically talks about him there meeting Jesus, becoming a disciple, and then he said talks about laying on his chest and being one of the, Peter, James, and John going up to Transfiguration, and ultimately the one thing that sort of stood out was after the crucifixion, or during the crucifixion, he was the only of those disciples who stood at the cross.
Mm.
The other ones had fled. So that was an interesting thing. I hadn't even really given that a lot of thought before. And then also the fact that the Virgin Mary, who again, growing up, I didn't really have that much of a relationship with. I mean, obviously I knew who she was, and I grew up, and I've said this a few times, I grew up in the town called Santa Maria, which is St. Mary. And I didn't even really give it a lot of thought, even though our football team, Santa Maria Saints, was the Saints. And she was like basically the patron of our town that I grew up in. And my family still lives there. So we go there often. Anyway, so she was very important on some level, even though I didn't really know a lot about her. And then when I realized at the end, at the crucifixion, that Jesus says to John, "Behold your mother," and to his mother, he says, "Behold thy son." And he puts them basically together. And that really raises a lot of questions, actually, because if you think about it, there are people, and I used to not be sure about this myself, thinking, oh, well, then didn't she have other children? They
Right.
talked about, the brothers or sisters. And so that raised that question. Well, if that's the case, why would Jesus say to his mother, Mary, here, this is your son, St. John? And why would he be the one who would basically be pretty much given her care if there are other relatives or other brothers and sisters or other children of hers? So
Right.
anyway, and then the question is, so what did they do together? Where did they go? And so those are stories that I didn't know about until I did a lot of research. And also then her whole life, the life of the Virgin Mary, also became very important, because I said, well, obviously we know who she is, the mother of Jesus. But then, when we use the word Theotokos, mother of God, that's a very deep level, which is almost a contradiction. How can that even be possible, to be a mother of God? God's,
Right.
can't have a mother, right?
Right.
But I learned, there's a lot more to that than just meets the eye. And, I did a lot of study. So that's basically how the book came together, was my dedication to St. John
Mm-hmm.
as my patron saint, and wanted to know more about him. So I did a lot of reading, a lot of studying, praying, a lot of hymnographies, songs and chants and so forth to him, and then also to the Virgin Mary. And so because they both were together, then I thought, wow, there's so many stories that I didn't know about, that I did a lot of research about. And I learned, there's all these, what they call proto-evangelium of St. James. It talks actually about the birth of the Virgin Mary. And
Right.
we have celebrations where we celebrate. Right now, we're actually in what we call the Dormition fast.
Right.
And so we're actually
Yeah, that's why I thought the timing was apropos for our conversation today.
right. And I didn't even, growing up, I had never heard of many of these terms or ideas or celebrations. What's this Dormition of the Theotokos,
Right.
or the Virgin Mary? And it's about her falling asleep or death, and her ascension, or the assumption. So some people use that word, assumption of the Virgin Mary, and many churches are actually named that. And so anyway, so there's a lot of things there that's like, wow, what does that even mean? And so, I'm a researcher. I've been writing books for, decades and decades on a lot of different subjects. So I've got this personality, some would call disorder, where I just get totally into different things, go
Right.
whatever I'm into, I'm just like totally into it.
No, I'm the same way. I whatever I get into, I become a bit obsessive with.
Right. Yeah.
And and regarding this book, I mentioned to you, for me, there's so many little tidbits that you have in here that obviously I'm familiar with the grand narrative of this book, talking about the Holy Theotokos, her relationship with Christ, all culminating in the ascension, and at the crucifixion, Christ telling John, "This is your mother now." And then, but there's all these little tidbits I can't wait to ask you about, and where you pulled from regarding the Orthodox tradition that kind of give it a tangible story and a narrative that plays out. And again, reading this book, you called it a creative historical fiction, because essentially you're kind of putting your own, how would you say, your own, you're putting a narrative together. You're putting things together in light of Orthodox tradition and how we understand it. How would you describe what you describe on page 7? This is a creative historic fiction.
Yeah, I say that because I do use poetic license. And even though I did do a lot of research, I mean, I've got tons of, these are just a couple, this is a whole book on the life of the Virgin Mary, the Theotokos. This is a book on the Holy Apostles. And this is what's called like a book of Akathis. These are all these, hymnography. There's a lot of what we call, holy tradition about it. So I drew from that, obviously starting with the gospel itself, the scriptures, the book of Acts and the New Testament, and the prophecies, even the Old Testament, we talk, behold, a virgin shall, give, bear a child, and even some of the stories that are in the scriptures where we start. But then I found that there's so many more, what we call traditions in the church fathers. And there's, St. John had disciples himself, which include like
Right.
Ignatius, Polycarp, these
Mhm.
have written actually writings themselves. And so I try to stay in tune with those. So I start with that. So I start with, what do I know is true, starting with the Gospels, pretty much the
Right.
one that we can rely on the most, part of
Right.
any tradition, the scriptures. And then going from there to, the feast days that we celebrate. The church has been celebrating things like the Dormition, of the Theotokos. And so it's like when you even hear that term, or the Annunciation, all these different things that we talk about, what does that really mean? What actually happened? When they say the Annunciation, so it's like Gabriel, the angel,
Mhm.
announcing to the Virgin Mary. And even some of these hymns and these things we hear, Hail Mary, full of grace, those are scriptural phrases.
Right.
Those are words that have been said by very, blessed art thou among women, blessed the fruit of thy womb. And those are things that I looked into. And so back to why I call it historical fiction or novel, is not that the stories themselves aren't true, but because it is based in the truth, real history, real people, real events. But because obviously I wasn't there, and even though I'm taking as much of that material, hymnography, uh, written traditions, scripture, of course, um, different other information that I have. And then I take that and then I use my own way of writing it, because my background is, I've written books on a lot of different topics, novels, but more screenwriting. I used to teach screenwriting, have MFA creative writing. Screenwriting
Right.
is my focus. So that's kind of how I look at things. That's when I did American Orthodox. I took those stories and decided, yeah, I can, I'm not like a historian, scholar, type of person. I have, Master of Fine Arts is creative writing. So it's not like I can
Right.
write academic papers, and I've done my share of them, but I don't like doing a lot of footnotes, and I don't like
Right.
trying
Right.
to analyze it all, or getting into the technical details, or according to so and so, and according to such, therefore here, that
Right.
and analytical writing. I can do it, and went to law school too, so I know legal writing. But at the same time, my preference is just telling the story, sharing it in a way that people can relate to it. So as you were saying, you're reading it like you are reading a novel.
Yeah.
And I think more people could relate to that. And ultimately, it's like, to me, I would see this when I write, I'm writing it like I'm writing a movie. That's why some people say, how can you write so fast? How come it's so flowery? How come it's this way and that way? And I go, because I'm writing it like I'm watching. If you watch a movie, you're seeing a whole life or whole
Right.
history in 2 hours. And
Right.
so I
It
write.
reads like that. That's exactly
That's
how
why I
it
write it.
reads. And
Right.
one of the things I was thinking, reading the book was, the Theotokos was one of the things that I had to develop a relationship with her when I became Orthodox. Because growing up Protestant, even though you mentioned all these phrases that are biblical right out of the gospel, referring to the Mother of God, there is really no place for her in the Protestant faith. And so, me growing up in that, um, you know, petitioning for the Theotokos's intercessions and praying for her intercession, it's just not part of that spiritual milieu. And so, reading this book, one of the things that I think really reinforces the Orthodox phronema is, one, the privileged status of the Theotokos and her purity and holiness, and who she was, and who the people and the apostles of Christ saw her as, and then two, the miracles, the mysticism, right? When you're talking about John, or you're talking about the Holy Virgin and the tearing of the curtain, which we're going to get to, because there's a little piece there that I didn't really know about. That was very interesting. But the calming of the storms on their way to Ephesus, and away from Ephesus on the way to Mount Athos, um, the persecution of Saint John and him surviving the poison and the boiling cauldron of oil, like, as Orthodox Christians, our faith is mystical. It is what I would say super rational. Some Protestants claim we're irrational. I'd say no. If God is God, well, God who created the heavens and the earth can walk on water as if it's land, because that's not a category error. And that's the way our faith is. It's a mystical faith. And your book kind of reinforces that phronema for people. And that's one of the reasons I think this is a great work for somebody who is kind of new to the faith. I think women who aren't so, they're not interested in learning about the essence energy distinction, as you said, with footnotes and this church father said this. This is a great way that, again, because it reads like a movie, they can dive into the faith, they can dive into the tradition of the church without it being pressed upon them like, you need to learn this. It's kind of presented in a more thematic way.
Yeah, and you mentioned the word phronema a couple times, and I want to, just
Yeah.
contact you on that word, because I know I've used it, and I know that a lot of people say, "What does that mean?" And and forgive me if I misdefine it, but I understand that as like worldview and mindset. It's like, how do you see the world? How do you think about things? And it's not really a question of, well, when you become a certain level of Christian, you understand things at a higher level. I mean, not saying that that's not true, that you can understand things more and more deeply. But I think phronema is like taking things in a different perspective. In other words, seeing things differently, being willing. And I think it really starts out with humility.
Yeah.
The idea of, and that's
Yeah.
one of the things I often like to say is like, I'm not young enough to know everything.
Right.
You
And
know,
go ahead. I was going to
oh,
say that
go
for
ahead.
me too, St. John, and I kind of briefly touched on this previously in our last conversation, but when you were mentioning your patron saint, St. John is incredibly important for my journey into the Orthodox Church. And that was one of the things for me why I kind of latched on, especially to the second part of this book. And right here is my icon of St. John, because as a non-believer, as somebody who was there we go, astute into secular philosophy and academic study of theology, but again, I'm not part of those man-made traditions. It was me understanding the theology of the Orthodox Church, and as that worked in my heart and in my spirit, then rereading the Gospel of John. I remember reopening that and reading the prologue, the opening of the Gospel of John, and everything just clicked. And this was a huge point for me where I could sort of put down the wall of rationalism and see, okay, no, this is a rational system. This isn't some fallacious man-made theology. I understand orthodoxy, and then reading the Gospel of John through, and then seeing as you described it, the gospel of love, or the theological gospel, as many people refer to, because the Gospel of John is not a synoptic gospel. Those are Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And of course, Mark begins at Christ and his ministry, where Matthew and Luke actually have the nativity and the annunciation and some of the earlier stories. But the Gospel of John was huge for me to really go 2 feet into the church and re-see it from an Orthodox standpoint of, again, as a non-believer, I had read all this Orthodox theology. And then when I read the gospel, I could see orthodoxy in it, and it just clicked for me. And so I'm incredibly indebted to St. John. And as you end the book talking about the importance of the Gospel of John and how people are still reading it in the 21st century, and yet it's speaking to their hearts and it's bringing people to Christ. I mean, that I felt like you were talking to me, because that was exactly my experience.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know, I've been through a lot of different, worldviews and perspectives, over, my many decades of life. And I remember times when I was very far from Christianity itself, and just even, or the basic, ideas in the relationship with God, Christ. And I remember at a couple times where the Gospel of John was, somebody actually gave me just like a little pamphlet and just had the Gospel of John in it. And I would just read that by itself. And it was just so full of love, as you were just mentioning. And that I would read that sometimes, and that would be all it would take just to really kind of soften my heart and just get me to turn myself back toward, the whole idea of reorienting, orient being east, the word, so returning towards, the rising of the sun of God, actually, literally, in this
Right.
case. Um, that gospel has been one of, I'd say, the most important parts of my own spiritual life as well, just as you had mentioned. And then same thing with also his other writings, which were the epistles
The
of John, which
epistles,
was all about
gospel,
love.
and Revelation.
And then Revelation, that one, and I, which that's the one that's a more amazing book, but it's also probably the most misunderstood and probably most misused. And I've definitely gone off the deep end a couple of times with some of these, what they call end times prophecies, and
Right,
so
right,
many people that have taken it and used it to basically to manipulate people. And I fallen victim a few times where it's like you just get into like a fear mode or something, because the world's going to
right.
end, the Antichrist, mark of the beast, and those are in there. But when you really come back to the message of the gospel, Christ Himself, and the personal relationship, literally. And then we also see the rest of the saints, that have helped us, including, not least of which, the Holy Virgin Mary, and this the softness that we have, and giving, back to the idea of the whole intercession thing. I know it's kind of a difficult idea for many of us to adjust to, like, well, why would you have to even talk to her? Just go straight to God, which you do go straight to God, but
Exactly.
it's the same thing too, like even in your own family, it's we talk to our mother, and say, "Can you tell Dad so and so?"
Right.
And sometimes there's a certain different relationship. I know that was the case in
Right.
our household.
Well, the Protestants, they don't understand that intercession is asking somebody to pray for you.
That's
Right.
basically
So
that's it.
we're not the Theotokos. When we pray to the Theotokos, we're not believing that she has some autonomy outside the will of God and can kind
Right.
of perform something for you. The idea is that God hears the prayers of the righteous. We believe that the saints are living, and we, just like your mother, Mom, will you pray for me? I'm going through a tough time. We then ask the Mother of God to pray for us, and that's something that again is kind of reiterated in the book.
Yeah. Just man, speaking of that, I mean, I don't think I would have. I don't think I'd be alive today if it wasn't for my mother praying for me. Because there were times when I was just so out there, probably breaking everybody's heart. It's like, where is he? What's he doing now? Oh, get that phone call. It's like, oh, Mom, can you come in? And you know, my mother, and I'm sure many of us have the same experience. They do pray for us, and so if we think of the Virgin Mary as really a mother of all of us, in a very real sense, and her relationship, just imagine her relationship to Jesus Christ, God the Father, and all the other saints, that she's really at the center of that relationship. Just like if you knew, like, just on a mundane level, you wanted to deal with like the head of some company or something, or some business or whatever. And you could say, okay, here's their email. You send an email. Yeah, and not that they won't get it, but it's like, oh, I know their mother. It's like, hey, can you tell your son to, call me? Then it's like you're going to get that phone call. So those are, I'm just using that as a kind of a mundane example. It's like if you have people who have a little bit more, and in her case, a lot more righteousness, uh, level of authority, and I know, just like I said, even my own mother, prays still, for me and for our family. And we always go, we have plenty of struggles, and we all pray for her too.
Right.
And so that's the thing, is we pray for each other. So that's the thing that we need to remember. And that's why it's important, I believe, to have people in our lives, not just on this earthly plane that we see on a daily basis, with their family members, people in our church, our neighbors, people at work and so forth, that we have good relationships with, and we do pray for, or we wish them well, if nothing else. But then we have, at a higher level, just realizing that this earth plane that we're living on is a very, very small percentage, or a small piece of the entire cosmic universe. We can't see 99.999% of reality. We can't, I mean, even in the physical plane we can't see, but just in our own, you know like what's in your own room, or what's in like 100
Right.
feet out from you, or even maybe 1,000 feet if you're up in a plane or something. But we definitely cannot see, what's going on in the cosmic sense.
Right.
I mean, although sometimes we do get some presence, there's sometimes that liminal space. That's why I talk about going on pilgrimages. And if you go to certain places at certain times, there's going to be a deeper level of connection. And that's why it's important even to have, there's certain people who, you know, for whatever reason, just, people we know that have a holiness about them.
Yep.
And there's something important about just having those relationships.
Well, I want to walk a little bit through some of the chapters. We're not going to give a huge synopsis of the book. Again, we recommend, and here is, I've already shared the link. You can get Beloved Disciple. It's available on Amazon. I'll share that link one more time in the live chat for everyone. But I have some personal questions for John as we move through, because as I said, there's some interesting little tidbits and details in his story, and he uses quotes. And so I would see things and you'd use quotation. I'm like, where is he pulling that from? But it was beautiful little tidbits on the historical and traditional connections between things. The opening of the book, chapter 1, is the birth of the Theotokos. And you talk about the barrenness of Anna, Joachim and Anna. And the part there that do you want to talk about the first couple of chapters? Because I have some specific questions, especially once the birth of Jesus. There's a couple thieves that they encounter on their way to Egypt that I had no idea of the connection with the crucifixion. That was the first thing I wrote down. I was like, I got to ask John about that. But the beginning is talking about her parents, how they were praying for a child. Anna believed that she was barren. And then lo and behold, God blesses them with the Holy Virgin, and that she has a destiny for the salvation of mankind. And this then is led into the presentation of the Theotokos at the temple and her being a temple virgin. Is there anything you'd like to kind of discuss in those two opening chapters?
Sure. Yeah, a lot of these are stories that, again, if you just read the Bible, which obviously is the most important book in the world, and the Gospels specifically is the most important. It does talk about the Virgin Mary, but it doesn't really, mentions some genealogies and so forth, but it doesn't really give us a lot of her life, her
Right.
early life,
Yeah.
particularly. There's just little hints here and there, little prophecies here and there, etc. So, however, if anyone is in any kind of like liturgical traditional church, whether it's the Orthodox, the Catholic Church, Anglican, and I'm sure some other Lutherans and others, there are days that we celebrate certain things, that there is a lot of background to, well, how do we celebrate this? Why do we celebrate this particular day? And even, the Annunciation itself, there's a lot. And if you listen to what we call the hymnography or hymnology,
Mhm.
the songs, the chants, and these what they call akathas and canons, and these long songs, basically, which are actually prayers. Then you'll find actually within those prayers, what's called like an akathist, and that's one of the things where I do draw from. This is, it's called like a book of akathists.
Mhm.
Here is just one of many, books like this, and it's got whole, the whole section on Agabus to the Most Holy Theotokos. There's 4 or 5 different ones, and there's one on Agabus to St. John Theologian. So that's a piece of it, but also more importantly, for those early stories, I draw a lot from this. Is called The Life of the Virgin Mary, the Theotokos. This book, I got this through the monastery. It's called Holy Apostles Convent in Buena Vista,
Oh,
Colorado, and they have some really good research and books. They do a lot of good work in that. And then there's another book here called The Lives of the Holy Apostles, which comes from them as well. And so that's where I got a lot of this. And then there's something that's called the Proto Evangelium of Saint James. And again, some of these are book kind of along the lines of things like, here like Book of Enoch, Book of Jubilees. They are books that are actually made, there's references to them even in the New Testament, those types of what we
right.
call apocryphal literature. They're not necessarily part of the Bible itself. They were saying, well, we're not going to include this because we don't really have all the verification that it's not written by one of the apostles specifically, or that we know for a fact, everything in here. But we still can reference it because we do basically read this book, and we do use this tradition. And so when you look back at the saints, the early church fathers, which include some of the ones I mentioned, like Saint Polycarp, Saint Ignatius, these were actually disciples, of Saint John the Theologian. And
Right.
you listen to, and so then they continue their teaching, what their apostle taught them directly. So it's all handed down. So that includes some of these other kinds of literature, which is, like I said, what's called Proto-Evangelium of James, and you can find that online, and there's different versions of it. And again, I'm not saying that that's an absolute, historical book, as far as everything that's in there is exactly what really happened, because again, people write and tell stories. And oftentimes, when you hear like Lives of the Saints, sometimes you'll get different versions of them, and sometimes they're a little bit flowery in their tone as far as, wow, did that really happen? But then back to, you talked about the word phronema. It's like we have a mindset of humility, and we say, well, it's kind of like if you have a certain type of mindset, then you can say, well, how could there be a virgin birth? How
Right.
could there be a resurrection? I mean, if you have that
Right.
kind of limited. I'm so intelligent. I know that that could never happen. God could never have created the universe, with his in the beginning, was the word, and he said, "Let there be light." That can't have happened, but I believe that it did happen, and I believe
Right.
God created the universe. I do believe that the Bible is true, that Jesus Christ was born of a Virgin Mary,
Yeah.
and those are things that I humbled myself to say. I don't understand all of it, but I do believe it, and I believe not just because, oh, it's in the Bible, so it's got to be true, because there's a lot of experience, personal experience in my own personal life, not just because, oh, God's rescued me, which, he obviously did, from many things, dangers, etc., but again, these things have been handed down for thousands of years. So it's not like this, somebody just made this stuff up just like in the last few years. And so I'm not taking anything and just coming totally out of my head with it. I mean, even though when I'm writing this, I'm writing it using some imaginative wording, some
Right.
phrasing, because obviously I don't know, I was sitting there listening to every conversation, everything that everybody said wasn't written down. But a lot of what's in this book, in Beloved Disciple, what I wrote there was all based on the stories that I've kind of immersed myself in, which is of her life, which there are versions that show her birth, and they do show, Joachim and Anna. If anyone's gone to a divine liturgy, you hear those names every
Yep.
liturgy, Joachim and Anna. Where,
Yeah.
we seek, that direct connection with all of them, and obviously the Virgin Mary is super important,
Right.
and we read the Gospel of John. So that's where it all comes from. These are things that have been handed down, and everything that's handed down isn't always, written down, and it's not. And even those things that are written down, they're not all written in the Bible. Even, the Bible itself even says about, John even says of all the things that he did, were written down. All the books of the world couldn't contain them.
Right. Well, the first question that I have, and one that kind of blew me away, I never even thought about, and it's not mentioned in chapter 2. Chapter 2 is about the Theotokos's presentation in the temple and her being a temple virgin. And then by the age of 12, which was customary for Jewish tradition, she needed to leave the temple. And of course, she is then betrothed to Joseph. But after, I think it's in chapter 4 or 5, when you were talking about after the crucifixion and the women come to the no, it's no, I'm sorry, before the resurrection. It's at the crucifixion, but the tearing of the veil. And in there, you mentioned that when the Theotokos was a temple virgin, she helped sew the veil that then was ripped, symbolizing the fulfillment of the Messiah. I had never heard that, and I did not know that at all. But that blew me away when I found that reading the book. Can you talk a little bit about where you found that?
Sure. Yeah. Again, I found that in one of these Lives of the Virgin Mary,
Oh, okay.
as well as in the Proto-Evangelion, and also in some of the hymnography. And actually, if you look at some of the iconography, if you look at some of these images of some of the icons of the Annunciation, where Angel Gabriel is coming to her, you'll actually see her with some thread. You'll see her
Oh,
like spinning
interesting.
yarn. So you'll see this, say scarlet thread, which is very
Right.
symbolic in and of itself, that,
Wow.
concept. And so that's where that image comes from, is that was what
Wow.
she did in the temple, according to tradition, that she, among other things, these quote temple virgins basically were these young girls, virgins, come start at a very early age, in her case, like 3 years old,
3 years old. Yeah.
and just literally living there, um, just being, helpers, and they would do things that they were able to do. And in this case, like sewing or what you call spinning yarn, things
Yeah.
like that. I don't know all the technical terms, but they were doing that type of work. And that was one of the things that she was known to do. And that there's, many of the traditions do say that that was one of the things that she was actually doing and did, was to spin the yarn, and the thread that helped, create the veil in the temple. And, we hear about the temple veil being ripped at the crucifixion. Now, there's some other traditions that actually say that she also spun or knitted, however you want to say it, the that seamless garment of
Oh,
Christ. So that's another. It's, you know, again, a lot of these
right.
people will say these things, and I've heard them and I've read them in different places. And there's a lot of things that I didn't include in the book, you know, just because there's so many
Yeah.
stories, and I'm trying to keep like what I call a through line. I mean, the original version when I first started writing this, I was just really going to write starting at the cross, where Jesus says, "Behold thy mother, behold thy son," and start it there and just go forward with it. You know, what did they do then after that? Because that was kind of what sort of incited me
Right.
into sort of inciting incident to me to say, wow, that's a really amazing. Or what, you know, what was their life like, you know, after
Right.
that? Because you don't really know, but it is written around a lot of his life and her life too, and then her dormition, as we
Right.
say. So that's where I kind of went there forward, but then realized, well, you know, let me fill this out because it would really be helpful if I actually go back. That's why the first couple of chapters, you know, really are more about her life, you know, and actually going even back to Joachim and Anna. It starts with them, and then it goes forward into, you know, the miracle of her birth. The Virgin Mary's birth is a miracle in and of
Right.
itself,
Right.
and and then of course, you know, her early life, and then growing, living in the temple. And so those are stories. It's like, wow, I'd never even heard any of these things before, but they are, you know, there's these have been written down for, you know, and they've been out there for thousands of years.
Right.
So this isn't just like new, or it's not just some modern scholar just
Right.
came up with some, you know, hidden, you know, text somewhere and says, okay, this is going to blow away all of Christianity because I just discovered, you know, this is what really happened. No, these are things that did really happen, but there are things that are well known, you know, by all the people who actually have been following these traditions for, you know, the last couple thousand years.
For everybody watching, smash that like. If you have any questions or comments for me or John in his book, Blessed Disciple, feel free to send those on Dono Chat, Streamlabs, or YouTube. The next thing that I wanted to ask you about was the one that I kind of mentioned first. It was the first thing that I wrote down, said I have to ask John about. Um, in chapter 4, you talk about the nativity of Christ and flight into Egypt. And people are going to be familiar with what came before that, Mary's betrothment to Joseph, Joseph and the potential scandal of her being pregnant, and eventually the nativity of Christ, all the ends being closed. But you then talk about Herod, and you talk about their flight into Egypt. And something that I had never heard, which I got to talk to you about, was everybody's aware of the wise men and the shepherds coming and bringing, especially the wise men, frankincense, gold, and myrrh to the Holy Family. We'll put it that way. And on their way to Egypt, they were actually encountered by a group of thieves and robbers, and they were going to steal the gold from the Holy Family and the things that they had just got as gifts for the birth of Christ. And in there, you talk about these two thieves, Justus and Dismas. And Dismas turns out to be, a couple chapters later, these are the two thieves on the side of Christ during the crucifixion. I'd never heard this before. That's why it blew me away. And that Dismas had a bag of silver that he had already stolen from somebody, essentially. And Gestus threatening the Holy Family, trying to get the gold and the goods they have on their way fleeing to Egypt. Dismas then says, "Here, just take my silver," and essentially spares the family, and they thank him. And of course, I immediately related that to the 30 pieces of silver of Judas, him taking the silver
Mm.
and you know, um, uh, betraying Christ. And then Dismas, who is also the thief, which we say every liturgy, you know, that remember me in your kingdom, Lord. And it turns out that those two thieves were the thieves that encountered the baby Jesus, not knowing who he was, going to steal from the family, and then they're being crucified by him. And it's the one thief that actually spared the family that is the one that recognizes who God is when he sees Christ on the cross. That blew me away. I'd never heard that before.
That is mind blowing, and that's something I learned as well. I was very mind blown. There is, you know, if anyone look up Saint Dismas, Dismas, that's him. And you actually had an interesting insight. You had said something as you were saying that, you know, it's like the 30 pieces of silver. I actually hadn't thought about it being like 30 pieces, but that would be amazing and very well could. It's very interesting that that could very well be. possible. I'm not saying that
Well,
that's,
yeah, I don't know if it's 30, but at least
but it's
symbolically,
just
the thing that
symbolically, it's
what popped in my head was that Dismas was outside the apostolic community, and yet
right,
he's the first one being saved, and he's
right,
giving his silver away, where Judas is in
right,
the apostolic community,
right.
and he's taking the silver, and of course, he's the first one to be condemned. And
Yeah,
I thought,
absolutely.
wow, what a beautiful symbolism there that I had never heard of.
Yeah, that is absolutely beautiful. And they even talk about him, this robber that actually like stole heaven. I mean, he stole paradise because he basically was able to get in before anybody else, and he
Right,
wasn't even one of the apostles. And then the one apostle, Judas, who was actually right there, then he's like the one who doesn't get in. And so that the silver, that's an interesting piece of the story. But I kind of look at it again, if you think about it, from my cinematic perspective. I mean, just imagine, the Holy Family, fleeing, and they've got, I'm sure all these camels and donkeys and so forth, and they've got all their goods with them, and the little baby Jesus, the mother Mary is carrying, and so then imagine, being confronted, these highway robbers, literally, and so okay, give us your gold, and what I see and how I've heard the story and read it, it's in the traditions that that those thieves, approached them. They were going to take everything, and then Dismas, the one thief, he looked upon them. He beheld the face of Christ and his mother, and was moved in his heart with compassion and the Spirit,
right,
and realized something that he couldn't explain, and it's like, no, we're not gonna do this, and I'll give you everything I have. And it's like easier for, if you're another thief, it's easier, okay, I'll just take what you have. It's easier than
yeah,
having to fight these people because I don't know what kind of weapons they may have. So it's, yeah, okay, we'll just pass on them. And then it's like you can just picture that eye contact, this
right.
little baby Jesus and this thief, just their eyes meeting, and just that compassion, and in his mother, will remember you,
Right.
you know. And then when he comes back, you know, 30 years later, or 30 some odd years later, then he's there, and that's him again.
Yeah,
Remember
I thought
me.
that was a beautiful, again, another little tidbit. There, we're going to get into a few more of these little things that even I myself I was not fully aware of that I loved in this book. The next thing I was going to talk to you about is skipping another chapter, is getting into the life of Saint John the theologian. Um, One, I'm going to ask you a general question, if you don't mind introducing him. Of course, he has a brother named James, son of Zebedee. Who they were, how did they meet Christ? But then I want to follow up, and maybe you can do that, and then I'll ask follow-up questions about their mother, because there's a couple things that you said about their mom that I was not aware of.
Yeah, well, James and John were, among the most, the initial apostles. They're fishermen, young. John was probably the youngest of them
Right.
all, and they came, or Jesus came to them as, and they, from what I understand, they actually were probably following John the Baptist earlier, or they were
Yeah.
at least part
That was,
of that community.
yeah, that's what you mentioned in the book.
And so their mother, from what I understand, named Salome, and then um, their father, they were all, it's a fishing family, basically, not
Right.
super wealthy, but they might have had some good lineage, so to speak, in the sense that they were connected. That there's a likelihood that Salome, the mother, is actually related to the Theotokos,
Yeah,
and
that's
so
what
that
you
there's,
mentioned, that Salome was a cousin of the Holy Theotokos, which I had never heard that either. That would mean, by some, again, we don't know what type of cousin, first cousin, third cousin, we don't know
Mhm.
how close of proximity, but that would insinuate that Christ himself had some familial, at least potential distant connection to John and James.
Yeah, and that's my understanding. And again, I'm not a scholar here, so I don't want to say, well, according to, and I have all the research. I mean, I've done, the research,
Right.
in the sense I've got, I mean, these are just a couple of the tons of other books I've read about it, and the hymnographies and so forth, other traditions. And people will interpret different things different ways, but there is a lot of connections there. to those families, just like as there is to like John the Baptist's family
Right.
to Christ. I mean, they're cousins
Right.
as well. So there's a lot of closeness within these the tribes of Israel, and people who are connected. There's not just all coincidence. Oh, we're just going to just get these random people. I mean, these are people like the Virgin Mary. It's not just some random, oh, I'll just take any you know woman off the street and just say, oh, she's going to be, she could be this person. No, it's like this is a lineage that God knew from the beginning, and he developed, and I won't say predestined in a sense, but just the idea that he is very well aware, God, of who he's dealing with here. And these people are all intimately connected in more ways than one. And so there's a lot more, I'll just put it this way, there's a lot more to these stories and to these connections to these individuals and their relationships with each other than just a quick glance of it's it, because even like the name Mary, and there's a lot of Marys.
Right.
And then, and I always think to myself, people always say, "Oh, they just made up the Bible. Oh, they just made up these stories." And it's like, well, if you really were going to make up a story, you would use a lot different names. You wouldn't just name like three different people Mary. That's just part of
Right.
that's writing 101. It's like you got to distinguish
And
every
James, there's a couple
person.
different Jameses too.
Right? Yeah, exactly. And Judas's.
Yeah.
So yeah, if you're anyone who's smart enough to write something that's going to be some myth that's going to just fool the whole world, which some people try to say about the Bible, they'd be smart enough to say, no, you got to have these distinct people. Just have one person with this name, then you got to have a blonde over here, she's this person, and you know what I mean. It's people don't take the idea that these things are actually the way that they were for a reason. There's a lot more to any story than what we just see on the surface. I mean,
Right.
just on a day-to-day basis, there's a lot more to every person's life than what you see. I mean, just like you and myself, we've got like a lot of stories that people just, they're seeing a small piece of what we do, where we are right now, but all the stuff that led to this, which sometimes is very difficult things and just twists and turns of life. But our families are interrelated on different levels, so that, I mean, we all ultimately say, can go back to say Adam and Eve, or back to Noah and the flood, or we can all say, yeah, we're all connected on one level. But then ultimately, one of the things that happens here is that when John and the Virgin Mary come together at the end, it's like, behold your mother, behold your son. So it's like really the whole family of God really comes together again.
Right.
So we are really a family. It's not just an intellectual exercise. It's not just about even an ethnicity, or just a list of genealogies and so forth. It's those things are they have their place. So I'm not saying there's no importance to
Right.
different nations and different ethnicities or different families, tribes, and so forth. Those they do have their place. God uses them in different places for different reasons. But again, the bottom line is that we have a lot more to it, and different levels of it than meets
Right.
the eye. I'll just put it that way.
Well, and Austin Graham said he just pulled it up in the Orthodox Study Bible and says the footnotes say that Joseph, being a righteous man, would have married within his tribe. Thus, Joseph and Mary would have largely shared a lineage, and they were both of the line of David. I saw that came up yesterday. I think Andrew Wilson was doing a debate with a black Hebrew Israelite who was claiming that Mary wasn't of the line of David, which is like literally written in scripture. I mean, that's the whole point of Christ assuming his humanity from Mary, is that she's from the line of David. But anyways, I digress.
Yeah. Now people make up all kinds of ideas as to justify their own, agendas,
Right.
things like what you just mentioned there. But what we try to do, and what I've been trying to do, back, use that word again, phronema, earlier, that mind of, having a humble, open to possibilities kind of mindset, and just a trusting in God, trusting in this tradition. And, a lot of times people will take that word tradition, make it into like it's a bad word. Oh, the traditions of men, it's all just made up stuff. No, these are things that we've been doing for thousands of years. That there's a reason for doing certain things in certain ways. There's certain people, and there's a reason why the whole world basically knows who Jesus Christ is. Everybody knows who he is,
Exactly.
whether you follow him or not. It's not like some person that just oh well, he's just another one of these many gods or myths or whatever, because there's actual evidence. It's not like you can say, okay, well, here I know where Zeus actually was born, and here's where he lived. We know, we have evidence of his family, or certain other ones that are out there, people that make up these things and say, oh, they're all the same. No, it's not true.
Right.
This is that evidential things. And again, I'm not an archaeologist or a scholar in this sense, but I'm talking, historically, there's more evidence for the Bible than pretty much almost any other book. I mean, it's like saying, oh well, you know, George Washington didn't exist. It's like, okay, there's a lot of evidence that says he did. There's as much, if not more, evidence that Jesus
Right. I
existed.
mean, that's one of the things. Even in modern day Israel, some of their archaeological excavations, they're finding coins, inscriptions that are literally referencing prophets as living during that time. So, say what you will about the nation state of Israel. Despite that, whatever their archaeological program they're doing, I mean, they're finding a lot of evidence that is revalidating so many things in the Old Testament. So, to your point, the Bible is one of the most accredited books in all of history. Another thing that I want to mention, since we're on John the theologian and his family, is Salome was also a follower of Christ. So she was one of the women that followed Christ, and you highlighted that she was also one of the 3 women that went to the empty tomb. I had never heard that. Did not know that at all.
Yeah, that's an interesting. Yeah, they call them myrrh-bearing women, and so these are, and there's evidence that she might have actually also been there at the birth of Jesus as like a what do you call it, a midwife in some senses. So I mean, a lot of these I can't say, oh, I know this absolutely for a fact, or I'm stating these as absolutes, because again, I'm not doing that.
But the tradition, Orthodox
tradition says
that's
a
what's
lot of
important
these
for me.
things that we're saying.
Yeah,
absolutely. And so that's why I wrote it the way I did it, because I want this to be an easy to understand story. And I mean, and as we all know, I mean, there's thousands of movies and shows, like the Chosen and other things like that are out there, books and stories, movies about Jesus and the Virgin Mary and others. And many of them get a lot of things wrong. A lot of things are wrong about them. I mean, especially if most of the stories about the Virgin Mary and Joseph totally misunderstand that relationship. It was nothing close to what you would see in Hollywood versions for the most part. Joseph, number one, was a much older man, most likely he had been married and widowed and had his own, children. And so he was basically given as more of the guardian, of the Virgin Mary. And so it wasn't like this romantic relationship.
Protestants will say, well, Jesus had brothers. That means the Holy Theotokos, she was not always a virgin. She had other children. It's like, no. I mean, Joseph was a widower. Joseph already had previous children.
Right.
The only child between the betrothed men of him and Mary is Jesus, which is divinely inspired. And so we do not believe that she ever had coitus even after.
She was. We call it ever Virgin Mary. If you look at the icons of her, you'll see 3 stars, and she was a virgin basically before, during, and after.
Right.
So those 3 stars that you see on her, if you see the iconography of the Virgin Mary, you see those. That's actually what that's representing. And also the whole word for brothers, sisters, that was a broad term that was used, just like we say in the church, we're all brothers and sisters, etc. But it was also a whole broader family, like you mentioned before with Salome and others, John, being relatives. So they would say, oh, those are your brothers, these are my brothers, these are my sisters, because they could be cousins, they could be 2 or 3 levels apart, but they would still use that term. But again, back to the idea that if you look at the cross, if St. John was there with the Virgin Mary, if there were other, quote, children of hers, they would have been there, first of all, or they would have been the ones that Jesus would have given her to take care of, or they would
Right.
be taking care of her, because of, I
Right.
mean, that's the thing with the traditional families, is they're very much into taking care of their own, their own family members, whether they're your parents or your children. They won't just let some stranger or some unrelated person take care of them before they will take care of them.
Right. Well, and let's move to the crucifixion, where that event happens. I mean, we're skipping through. We already kind of discussed chapter 5, John's journey with Christ. Chapter 6, you discuss again why he is the most beloved of the disciples. He's somebody who actually speaks less. Peter's a little bit more boisterous than John. Yet it's John that has the profundity and the understanding. And we even see this in the transfiguration icon, where we see John's the one. Again, it's kind of the three dispositions when you recognize who Christ is. John's the one that's moving towards it. James is stunned and kind of in his place. He's not moving forward or backwards. And then it's Peter that's turning away from it. And we kind of see these three dispositions, and it's John who is the most beloved. It's John who's the ideal. It's John who's the only one that's not a martyr, who lives in at the very old age, especially for the time period.
I'll just real quick, because
Yeah, go ahead.
Transfiguration, we just celebrated yesterday in the new calendar, and that back to that icon too. The three, Peter, James, and John were the three that he chose to go up there with him. Because they, those 12 disciples, he didn't bring all of them, because number one, Judas was still among them. So obviously you're not bringing Judas up there. and also, you don't want to bring everybody except Judas, because then you go, oh wait, how come he doesn't go? Oh, because he's going to betray us later. Oh well, let's keep him down. Anyway, the three, but they also represent faith, hope, and love. Those three, James, Peter, James, and John. Peter, being faith, because he was the one who gave that proclamation, that you are, the Christ, Son of the living God. It's like upon this
and the
rock.
one to walk on water, right? He's the one that began to have the faith and lost the faith, and then again through that story, seeing how important the faith is. So that
Right.
goes exactly to your point about the symbolism.
Right. And then James was actually the first of the apostles to be martyred. And so he had that hope. He was willing to die because he had the hope of the eternal life. And then John, being beloved, was love. So those faith, hope, and love there. Anyway,
that's great. I hadn't heard that explained that way.
Insight.
And then so chapter 8 gets into the road to Golgotha, where, unfortunately, John and the Theotokos are following Jesus. I mean, brutally being beaten, having to carry the cross, being mocked on his way to Golgotha. And then it's here where, of course, the weather changes, the storms happen, and we see then the story of the two thieves, one recognizing who God is and in a repentful, honest, sincere heart, accepted into the kingdom. Where the other one's mocking him and saying, well, if your God is real, why are you here? Like, get yourself out of here. Which, again, as we just said, was the one who actually threatened the Holy Family and was going to steal from them on their way to Egypt. And then it leads into chapter 9, which is the words that changed everything. And this is kind of and I would argue this kind of pivotal chapter of the book, where it moves from kind of a buildup to how Mary and John come together, at least in regard to the crucifixion. You want to speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, and that's really, like, again, that was the essence in the inciting incident of the whole book, is at the cross, behold your son, behold your mother. And that's invoked that whole question, number one. And you mentioned too, John was the only of the 12 disciples who was not martyred. I mean, he was definitely a passion bearer, in the sense that he was tortured, and we'll get into that in a minute. But he actually lived to like 100 years old. And so that was so those are questions, like, so what happens, now that, again, we've already established that the Virgin Mary didn't have any other children. She was a virgin, not only before marriage, but actually during the birth. It was a miraculous birth. So that birth, and I won't, get into the graphics of it, but from what everyone says, and again, those traditions say that birth occurred in a way that, just like Jesus can walk through walls, so to speak, it was literally a painless birth. in the sense that it wasn't quote natural, I mean, in this, in the
Right.
ultimate sense that she would maintain her quote virginity, and then afterwards, meaning that she never did have any other children, never had those relationships
And
with
when Adam
anyone.
and Eve were cast out of the garden, man was his curse was the toil. He has to labor, and then the women have
Right,
birth pangs. And so
right,
you see that in
right.
that inversion, and how
It's an inversion.
Theotokos then brings Christ into the world, and she doesn't have the birth pangs, kind
Right.
of symbolizing the pre-fallen ideal woman.
Yeah, and speaking of that too, she's also considered like our new Eve. Just
Yes.
like where they say Eve was born out of the side of man. You know, Jesus was actually literally born out of quote the side of the
Right.
woman, so to speak. And that you saw how he was pierced in his side. Gave out blood and water. That's like the communion, holy communion and the baptism. And so that, the woman, Mary, now inverted what Eve did. Jesus was basically the new Adam. She's like the new Eve. So we now have a new family. We're reborn into the quote, the new man, which is Jesus Christ himself.
Absolutely. Yeah. Um, and so then John and the Holy Theotokos, they find themselves at the foot of the cross, and Christ then tells John, "This is your mother, this is your son," and basically um, makes John the future guardian of the Theotokos until of her dormition. And so that's, as we pointed out, this was, to me, the crux of the book is chapter 9, the words that changed everything. And chapter 10 then moves into the myrrh bearer and the beloved disciple. And again, that's where you talked about the mother of the sons of thunder, Salome. And
Yes.
in that, again, women were not allowed to be witnesses to anything back then. Their testimony didn't carry any weight. I believe it had to be like 3 or more women to equal to one testimony of a man, which again, the irony, 3 women going to the tomb. And it also highlights that, despite what people want to say about patriarchy or these traditional religious frameworks, Christianity celebrates women within their correct context in relationship to God. And it even does so by demonstrating that the first 3 witnesses to the empty tomb are 3 women, which are 2 Marys, and then Salome, which, again, because of your book, I now am aware of.
Yeah, and that's back to, and to your point too, is I mean, the greatest of all this quote, the saints in the church is the Virgin Mary. I mean, so we definitely honor, the women, probably more so in many cases, in this particular way, obviously, and the fact that those myrrh-bearing women, the bravery that they were actually going to that tomb, knowing that it was supposedly guarded by the Roman soldiers. And so what were they going to face there, going there with that understanding that, they're under siege basically. And we're just going to go anyway, because this is what we need to do. This is our Lord, and we're going to honor him the best that we can. And whereas most of the other disciples were all scattered and still kind of hiding out,
Right.
unfortunately, until later, which we have the day of Pentecost, Holy Spirit comes, and then that's another.
And that's chapter 11. So that's where I was going next. It's the descent of the Holy Spirit in the mission of St. John. You do mention the death of Stephen,
Yes,
and him being the first martyr of the church.
right.
And that is actually, I'm getting ready to do a stream on the history of Baal and Moloch worship. And of course, it's Stephen that is calling out the Star of Remphan and the worship of Moloch during his time.
Mm.
And of course, it's the Jews then that are mocking and persecuting him and killing him. And even in the midst of all that, never recanting his faith in Christ.
Well, it's interesting too. I have a friend, Corey, shout out if he's listening, who's getting baptized into the church this Saturday. And Stephen, the proto-martyr, is going to be his patron saint.
Oh,
Literally, I
glory to
just
God.
asked him. I saw him yesterday at the Transfiguration, and I knew he was getting baptized. And I was like, "Oh, by the way, who's your patron saint going to be?" And he said, "Stephen, the proto-martyr." So that's interesting that you're mentioning him right now. So if he's watching, Corey, many years on your back, and I'll be there, Saturday.
Okay, and so chapter 12 gets into it's called the flight to Ephesus. And again, during that time, the cult of Artemis, Ephesus was deeply entrenched into magic and the occult and some of this ancient pantheon religion. But you had a couple, at least the story, the narrative that you paint is St. John and the Holy Theotokos are on a boat moving from the Holy Land from Jerusalem over to Ephesus, and they encounter this incredible storm. And eventually, at some point, the waves rock the boat so much that John is thrown overboard. And it's when he's then lost in the darkness of the sea that he kind of feels and experiences the inner light of Christ. And then he comes up to the surface, and uh, it's the Theotokos and his Prokoros. What was
Yeah,
um,
Prochorus, yes.
are there to lift him out of the ocean or the sea. Can you describe a little bit like where you're pulling that from? Because that was a piece again of the narrative that I had not heard.
Yeah, these are yeah, I have this book here. It's called The Lives of the Apostles. Again, this is just one of many, and this comes like from Saint Dmitri of Rostov's. He does a lot of Lives of the Saints. So if you read Lives of the Saints and listen to the hymnography again of the saints, which is the canons, what we call akathis, there are long, hymns that have all these little, you know, stories within the hymn, and different. It's very, poetic, but that's where we found this. That's where I found it, is in these Lives of the Saints, and in his particular Lives of the Apostles, and in the hymnography, it talks about, him almost drowning in the sea, and many other of the stories that you're going to find now. And that's, again, when I first started this book, I was actually going to start it right there at the cross and then just move forward, which is obviously going to be more, cinematic in a lot of
Right,
ways.
right.
But I really wanted to bring in the fullness of the story of the Virgin Mary, because that was really, obviously she's so important. And a lot of her story, most people don't know. So I said, well, this is the perfect time to give a fullness, of both stories and how they come together. And then going there up to her dormition and assumption, and then to what they do, between then, and then what moves forward with John.
The next chapter, the fall of Artemis, I love because it describes John's arrival and the Holy Theotokos in Ephesus, and he just begins talking about Christ. Of course, some of the locals and some of the local priests begin to challenge him, and just by him speaking the truth about who Christ is, the marble in the temple to Artemis begins to crack. I love that section of the book. Do you mind talking a little bit about that?
Sure, yeah, because that's the thing, is the name of Jesus Christ is the name that, everyone will bow down to
Right.
ultimately, whether we
Amen.
believe or not. It's not
Amen.
a question that, there's a reality to the incarnation. God Himself, the Holy Trinity, Father, Son, Holy Spirit. It's one God. And we'd say, there's a phrase that says, the Jesus prayer burns the demons. And so it's like, even just the name itself, they tremble, because they even say that, the demons believe and tremble. And so just the name of Christ Himself, Jesus Christ Himself, does have an effect. That's why a lot of people just don't want you to mention
Right.
Him, especially like in the schools or
Well,
in
according to
public.
Kanye West, I mean, what was it, a couple months ago? He said when he signed a contract with Rock Nation under Jay-Z, one of the stipulations during the albums he wrote is that he was not allowed to promote or mention Jesus Christ, which
Oh,
gets
wow.
exactly to your point. I mean, that's a contemporary cultural reference, but it gets
Yeah.
to your point about the spiritual warfare and the power of Jesus Christ and actually proclaiming who He is and believing in the incarnation of God.
Absolutely. So that's what happens there, is just, as you see in the book of Acts. Anyone who's read the book of Acts sees, these demons just being cast out, or just even people, you know reacting to these apostles, when they walk by, because there's so much power in that spirit of God that's in them, and the name itself, and the preaching of the gospel, and the name of Jesus Christ, is power. And in this particular case, the city of Ephesus, was totally dedicated to, like pagan idolatry and so
Yeah.
forth. And then that reacted to that power.
And then the next chapter, chapter 14, then talks about them leaving Ephesus, which again John will eventually come back to. I'm sure we're gonna get back to that as we move further in the book. But then he and the Holy Theotokos, they leave Ephesus and they encounter the Holy Mountain, and that this is the sort of the beginning of what Mount Athos becomes. And you describe how both John and the Theotokos, that they then see the future of Orthodox monasticism and men devoting their life to Christ on this holy mountain, which is then Mount Athos. I thought that was a beautiful narrative as well in chapter 14.
Yeah, and it's called they call it the Garden of the Theotokos.
The Garden
This
of the
is
Theotokos.
her, place. That's why there's no, it's all monastic, men
Yes.
that go there and even are allowed to visit it, because she is pretty much the only woman there, to just kind of maintaining her purity and just to keep the holiness of that mountain, dedicated to her.
Right.
That there are, I don't know how many monasteries there are now there. Do you know? It was like at least like there's dozens of them,
Yeah,
different ones with thousands of people in there.
Yeah.
And I
I'm
have
not
never
sure on the
been.
exact
I know
one.
you went. Didn't you go? Or you
Yes,
went?
I have. Well, I wasn't able to go on Mount Athos. I went so it was during the time I was proposing to my wife. So we set up the female or the women's and children's pilgrimage, which we were
Okay.
surrounded by Romanians. There was tons and tons of Orthodox Romanians there. So you leave Orianopoli and you get on a boat, and of course, the women can't go 100 meters towards the shore of Mount Athos. So they just circle the peninsula. And one of the monastics of one of the Greek monasteries came out with relics. And so he had this big box. They put it on a boat. Then he drives out to the bigger boat where all the people are. And then they pull out the stuff. There's probably 3 monastics. And they had like a piece of the cross, relics of St. Matthew, just incredible stuff. Apostolic relics.
Wow.
And so then all the women and children, and of course, a lot of men are there with their wives, are able to venerate and get blessings from the monks and stuff like that. So that's about as close. I do plan, God willing, to go back, and I've already negotiated with my wife. I want a couple nights, maybe 2 or 3 nights on Mount Athos. So I hope, God willing, be able to do that in the future. But, I was going to say, regarding the connection to the Theotokos, obviously any icon demonstrates that she is the lady of the mountain. It always has the Holy Theotokos looking over Mount Athos. But her belt, one of the incredible relics still present on Mount Athos, is the belt of the Holy Theotokos. I can't remember which monastery it is that has it, but that's one of the more incredible miracle working relics that is still present.
Yeah, that's an amazing story, and that's the. I've heard one version of it where it's actually it was part of her what they call the Assumption of the Virgin Mary, which is like she actually, and we talk about this I talk about it in the book, that there are, if you go to Jerusalem and to the Holy Lands, you're going to find tombs, and relics, of saints, but 2 of them, well, 3 that you will not find a body, even though you have the tombs, is Jesus himself. He's no body. Where's the body? The Virgin Mary, they have where she was buried, but then her body was assumed, from what we understand, like as in an ascension, miraculously. So there's no body of the Virgin Mary there. And also St. John, which we'll talk about in a second.
Right.
But for back to the belt, I heard this, and this may not be, inaccurate. I may be remembering it. Someone else, wants to comment on what they think about it. I heard that there was like where she was like actually ascending into heaven or something, or there was some event where she appeared or did something, and that belt was given during some miraculous period of time, some event. I don't remember exactly right off the top of my head.
Right.
Have you heard that?
I have heard that.
Yeah.
Again, I can't claim actually where it's from. That should be a stream topic. I should dive into some of the relics on Mount Athos, and because the backstories are the most incredible stuff. I mean, just in one of the other books, you're talking about the Iveron icon.
Yeah, I was just
in
going
the
to mention
origins
that.
of that.
whole stories there. The EM and the other book, this one here, Light Journey, which is all about encountering saints, miracles, and sacred places. I get into that Iran icon, which is a Mer streaming icon, and the whole story of Brother Jose Munoz, Canada, who many may consider a saint, and how that icon also, which is of the Virgin Mary, and then later the same icon, not the exact physical one, but the same general one was found by the in Hawaii by Father Nectari, who's now a priest. He was deacon at the time, and so there's this Mer streaming icon that has its origins there. And actually, that had its own whole story that it kind of miraculously even appeared there. So, those, as you said,
I just spoke with someone who saw it in Ohio and said it was streaming myrrh. I have yet to be able to venerate it, but he said it was incredible, and he was able to actually be there for the presentation of it at a service, and said at one point during the liturgy, the room just started to fill with myrrh. And then everybody started to go up there, and he said it was incredible. I mean, the thing was just pouring out myrrh.
Absolutely, yeah. And I've seen it many times. Well, I'll say several times, including in Hawaii, where it is, but also here in Sacramento and in San Francisco, that Mer streaming Iran icon. So anyway, just mentioning that, because if anyone ever gets that chance, just keep that in mind. That's definitely worth
on my to-do list.
An experience when it comes your way, if it does.
Chapter 15 then concludes, at least with the life of the Theotokos and the Dormition of the Theotokos, and talks about the sort of the coming, her repose, and the coming of her her life, and the burial and the miracle of the withered hand. This was pretty interesting. If you don't mind getting into this, that a non-believing Jew, Pharisee, wanted to actually tip over the coffin that her body was in, and while they were bringing her to the burial site, and when he went to go tip it over from the hands of the apostles and the believers and followers, his hand withered away. And then the apostles come, and Peter then prays over him. And just like when Peter cuts off the ear in Gethsemane, because I loved how you drew the connection there. Again, just like the silver and the stuff, then there's another connection where then it's Peter who cuts off the ear in the Garden of Gethsemane. Well, now it's Peter that's calling on Christ's mercy to then heal this withered man's hand. Of course it does. And now he becomes a believer.
Right. Yeah. That's another one of those traditions that, we find, and again, I really highly recommend, well, I'll say it this way. The reason I wrote this book is because there's so much information that's out there that you do have to kind of dig around to different places to try to kind of piece it together. And it's not always easy reading, you've read Lives of the Saints, many of them. And I try to read daily, something from the Lives of the Saints, whether it's through the prologue, etc. But I know that a lot of it, can be, very difficult, because there's
especially for the rational mind. I think it's more, and this was one of the thoughts I had, especially the second half of the book, is that for so many Western Christians, modernism, which again, a lot of people are just oblivious to the influence of that regarding their paradigm and their worldview, they don't have this mystical, miracle-filled perspective of Christianity, and I think if you were, obviously, if somebody in the medieval period or even, pre-Enlightenment, they wouldn't really think twice about some of these stories, because this is the tradition, and it's not just tradition, but also the worldview allowed, I would say, for the perception of things that I think rationalism actually hinders our ability to perceive miracles. Because I do believe miracles, I'm sure you do too, miracles are happening every day, but because of the ways in which we epistemologically limit how we come to know something, there's no space for the miraculous in the Western mind. And I think that's one of the problems with, just Western Christianity in general. It's too modernistic in its approach to a transcendent, eternal, miraculous faith.
Yeah, no, absolutely. There's a lot of, I guess we'd say like nominalism and materialism and rationalism and those types of things that try to reduce, reductionism, et cetera. So it's like everything has got to be some scientific explanation, and saying, well, if it doesn't fit in what I believe, then it can't be true. So, okay, so you're saying that just because you don't believe it means it can't be true. So that's pretty arrogant, don't you
Right.
think? Just because you don't understand something doesn't mean it's not true. I mean, it's like you can say, whether it's, we'll just use it, a figure of speech and say, gravity or whatever it is.
Right.
Doesn't matter whether you believe in it or understand it or not. There's still, a reality
Right.
to it. Whether you want to call it something different or not, that's fine. You can say it's buoyancy and density, or you can use
Right.
other names, but it's still a reality that doesn't matter how you understand it or whether you believe it. And so that's the same thing with these things that we're doing. I'm trying to tap into this, and I do believe that by doing it in the way that I'm trying to do here, and forgive me, for my own uh, lack of humility and maybe thinking I have the ability to retell these stories any better than they've been told. But I do know that we all have a way of telling a story, and there's a place for reaching people. In a sense, there's a certain place for like at least a modern way of using a language so that you can at least explain it to somebody where in a way they understand. Just like when the missionaries came to Alaska. If anyone's seen Sacred Alaska, we
Yes.
talk a lot about that. That was my inspiration for American Orthodox. That they came to the natives and they needed to, not like make up anything new about the faith. They're not going to change anything, but they do want to at least understand, what do the people here, what do they believe, what are they seeing, and what, is their tradition. Now let's find, what's good there, because all goodness is from God.
Right.
All truth is God's truth. So it's not to say that, oh, just because somebody's not a Christian, oh, they have like no truth or they're just totally, bad people or anything, because that's not reality. I mean, there is
Right.
goodness, there's truth, we're all creating God's image. So beauty, is there. And so that's what I try to do here is I'm trying to reach people through, how people do communicate nowadays is through like storytelling, through like a cinematic, visual, ways. That's why I try to keep the books relatively shorter, because, like I said, I could have written like the American Orthodox. I could have written like 400 or 500 pages, and go into all the different saints, a lot of names and dates, a lot of details. I said, no, let me take this and put it into a story in a place, one main character, one main place, location, and then just focus it around, whether it's Fort Ross in this case. Speaking of which, there's a whole. I'll mention this later, but Fort Ross pilgrimage is something I really recommend anyone to do. I know I'm jumping off topic here by saying that, but I'll mention it again just to say that there's a
Sure.
place that we should all look to this miraculous, and that's how part of the American Orthodox was part of that miraculous. My personal experience and kind of tapping into these stories, and that's what
Right.
I try to do here with the Virgin Mary and Saint John.
Yeah. Well, and also that you end this chapter regarding the Dormition about how Thomas was late to arrive at her burial
Mhm.
service and that he had a vision. He tries to hurry and get there. He's like a day or two late. And then they go and take him to her burial site. And lo and behold, there's nothing there.
The empty tomb again.
Yeah.
Yeah, a lot of parallels. And it's interesting, even the whole story of the gathering of the apostles. I mean, there's a lot of different versions of how they were all gathered from all, they were out there doing their apostolic missionary work and all throughout the world. And the fact that they were, we didn't have the internet in those days. Okay, send out a group text, everybody, you know, we're gonna do a, meet up or whatever. No, it's like the Spirit of God, reached out, through, whether through angelic hosts or through just God's word, to these apostles in all these places. Then, and as you said, Thomas, who was late to the resurrection,
Yeah, late to the party.
yeah, he came late here too. But it's like he added to it. So thank God for Thomas, Saint Thomas,
Right.
because it's not like about his doubt or his lateness. It's about that he allows us now to speak to that part of reality that's like, well, how could this happen? And then he actually comes there, and then they actually see that the tomb is empty. So if it, maybe
Right.
if it wasn't for that, they would have just kind of say, oh, we're just going to leave that tomb there. And then,
Yeah.
a
I
thousand
love this
years later,
comment. Thomas missed another important event. I love that. And then we get into chapter 16, which is the kind of the rest of the book is now a focus on St. John the theologian. And this gets into his confrontation with sorcery and his exile to Patmos. You want to talk a little bit about some of the trials and tribulations he had to face under Emperor Domitian, and yeah, go ahead. The boiling oil. I think some people are probably maybe aware of the cauldron of the boiling oil, but it is actually preluded by a poison cup that he has to drink.
Yeah, yeah. As I mentioned, all the other apostles, had been martyred, and suffered, death, different tortures, under these emperors, Nero and others. Whereas John, had been also persecuted by them, and then under this emperor Domitian, as I believe, he, again, we know they don't want people out there proclaiming this king, this
Right.
resurrected God, because they want their own gods, and then they are themselves, the gods, the emperors, so to speak, in their own minds, wanting to keep control. So, they're threatened by this power, that they're seeing, and they're seeing all these people going to them. And anyway, what happens is he's brought before them, as a prisoner, persecuted, and he was then condemned to death for his, going against the gods, of Rome, and was given a cup of poison as his punishment of death. And he drinks the poison, and he doesn't die. And so they're like, and these are all these sorcerers that, whip up these concoctions. They say, okay, this is like,
Yeah.
super hemlock,
Yeah,
extra
exactly.
Socrates dose.
Well, we're on Socrates. Let's get John.
Right. And so anyway, didn't work. So they're like, emperor's like giving them sorcerer like side eye, like, hey, you, it's like,
Yeah.
you're supposed to be doing your job here. And
Yeah.
they're, well, let's get the cauldron, okay, we know that'll work. So they get this cauldron, I can't even imagine how big this thing is, but just boiling oil, if you can, imagine, if you're like making some like giant, like thing of
Right.
French fries or something.
And you
And
had a poetic line talking about how the heat of the oil distorted the air around it, like I forget exactly how you put it. It's kind of like a desert, when it's really hot. And you
right, you
kind of
see
see
like, yeah,
that.
those waves. Yeah, just picture it. That's why I try to do this like I'm watching a movie. It's like, okay, I'm seeing this boiling oil, and it's like this is like this shimmering, waves
Well,
above it. And then they go ahead.
I was going to read.
Yeah.
It says the heat radiating from it, distorting the air like waves over a desert. That really
Right.
painted the scene for me. I'm thinking like ancient Rome, St. John bounded, led by the centurions up to the cauldron, and then you mentioned they push him into the oil.
Right.
And just thinking about the scene, the people probably cheering, some people aghast at what's happening. Everybody's on edge. Really painted the scene for me.
Yeah, and then he just goes into it, and everybody's like, you can imagine, like these Colosseum types of things, or like the three holy children, Cedric, Meshach, and Abednego, they throw them into the furnace.
Right.
But little do they know, boom, he comes like popping out, bounds are free, and they're like, what? And just, you can't, I mean, it's hard to even imagine the reaction, but, I try to describe it, as best I can, my limited imagination, that they're, okay, we better like not try this again, because, we're going to look really bad. We look bad enough by saying that we can't even kill this guy. So we're going to banish him to Patmos. That's going to be your punishment. That's going to be worse than these things. We weren't really trying to kill him. We were just like, punishing him with these things. You
Right.
can imagine what excuses they're making to the people who are like, what do you guys,
Yeah. And imagine that position too for the emperor, where you have this guy confessing a different god. It's kind of disturbing the peace of your empire. And then you try to kill him twice. You're witnessing a miracle. And then you're afraid to kill him because you think you'll make a legend out of him and it's going to spread even more. So you just exile
right. Right. Yeah. Let's not make him a martyr then, because that's obviously not working anyway. But yeah, we're gonna just send him out, and yeah. So that's where that chapter I think ends. Is
Well,
off to Patmos with him.
well, and then and in Patmos, you talk about the sore Canops. How do you pronounce that
That's how
name?
I would say Kenops. Yeah,
Okay.
Kenops, a sorcerer.
Yeah, you want to talk a little bit about that? I had never heard
Yeah.
that story either about
Yeah.
he gets to Patmos and there's a sorcerer that's trying to challenge him in his revelation of Christ.
Yeah, again, everywhere he goes, I mean, this is, the pagan world. I mean, it's like basically like it is today. Wherever you go, there's going to be powers that be, so to speak, various, these satanic elites that run their little fiefdoms in areas. And it's like, no, we don't really want your type over here, with your, Jesus, etc. So that's what happens at Patmos is there's this, territorial, sorcerer basically who's like in charge of it, and he challenges them. And what ends up happening is he basically gives them this challenge, that he can do all these miracles. And what happens is that he's like, oh well, go over to this water and see what happens. And then he ends up drowning himself. And then again, all of this, this sorcerer um, basically drowns himself because he's like totally doesn't have any power. And then all of his gods, which are not really gods, they're just demons.
Right.
You
Well,
John
in that
is
general pattern though of um sorcery and magic obviously is sin, and that it leads to the man's own self-destruction. I mean, the way you paint it in the book is he's conjuring spirits that manipulate the weather, and so the ocean begins to rise, the winds begin to swell, and then John offers a prayer to Christ, and then it begins to diminish, and yet then Canops is sucked into the storm that he himself tried to create. And it made me think of the story of Saint Cyprian and Justina. Saint Cyprian of Antioch, the great wizard, renowned wizard, who's paid to perform magic to get this virgin, this pious virgin Justina, to marry this man. And none
right.
of the magic works. Eventually, Saint Cyprian goes to see who this girl is. None of his magic is working, and he sees her praying in a church, fasting, and he becomes emotionally moved by it, and then sees it's her piety, it's her righteousness that is like a shield to the demonic forces. He ends up converting, he becomes a bishop, and then at the end of their lives, they're both martyred together. I mean, what an incredible story.
That's a story in itself too.
Yeah. So it kind of gave me flashbacks of that story about, Canops is not repenting from his sorcery, and it leads to death. And then we have Cyprian, who is killed with Justina eventually. But I mean, according to tradition, his evangelism of Orthodoxy was so powerful that there were essentially no pagans left in the area of Antioch by the time he was bishop, which is incredible.
Yeah, it really is. And there's so many other stories that I didn't include. I mean, so I try to highlight, stories at these different places, like at Ephesus and Mount Athos and at Patmos, showing these are some of the travels and these are some of the things that they really did encounter. And these battles, these spiritual battles, which we all deal with, at different levels, but it's very dramatic when you see it, in these particular ways.
And so then this moves into chapter 17, which is discussing probably one of the things that are most iconic about Patmos is the revelation of John. Could you describe a little bit about what he experiences on Patmos and what becomes then the last book of the New Testament, the book of Revelation?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the almost towards the ending of his life, towards the end, where he's there exiled. And then just if anyone's read the book of Revelation, I mean, it's just so incredibly visually stunning and under hard to even understand what are we actually seeing. But just picture being there and then just being like in this this cave, which he's like probably is like his shelter. And he does have his assistant that does come at some point, where he does eventually have him write these things. Procors, if you see many of the icons of St. John, you'll see him and you'll see the Holy Spirit, and then you'll see somebody else next to him with a little pen and a tablet writing, and that's Procors. That's his disciple. But he sees these visions. I mean, God basically, it's the word Revelation is like revealing, or Apocalypse, it's like unveiling. So just imagine, as I said earlier, we talked about, we can only see a very small piece of the spectrum. Just
Right.
imagine like all the different light and energies, everything from ultraviolet, X-rays, etc. But then there's way beyond, the spectrum of light and sound and heat, etc., energy, to the spiritual realm. And
Yeah.
just imagine, we're surrounded, as they say, by a cloud of witnesses. So we have these saints around us, watching us, kind of cheering us on, guardian angels. But there's also some other forces out there, and there's, time and space are very different. We're in, what we, have a kind of a chronological time, but there's this kairos time, which is this eternal nowness that's eternity. And so when you are in that realm, there is no, yesterday, today, and tomorrow. It's like Jesus
Right.
Christ is, yesterday, today, and forever.
Right.
I am the Alpha and the Omega, Alpha,
Right.
Omega. It's the beginning and the end. It's all one. It's one big thing. And so he's actually gets this glimpse, this unveiling, like back to the veil,
Right.
the temple, thinking about that again.
Yeah.
It's ripped in two now. And so that's open, but he's actually there. And because of the purity of his life and his suffering and so forth, and, his dedication, God has now given him this revelation. All the other apostles that are long gone, and he's now seeing, what is perceived as, the end of time.
Mm-hmm.
And if you think about it, this is, we're talking, you know, this is before the end of the temple in Jerusalem, which that happened in 70 AD.
Right.
So a lot of what he's seeing, and many traditions will refer to this. A lot
Yeah.
of the things that he's actually seeing are those things that were just getting ready to happen. So
Right.
he was, in many cases, speaking in the book of Revelation about, immediate, realities, and using, a lot of code words to, talk about the powers that be, Babylon, etc., in ways that oftentimes get misinterpreted. Not to say that there aren't different levels of it, but in some cases he was actually speaking about, that, he was talking to these. There's like 7 actual literal churches and bishops of these churches. He's saying to the angel of
Right.
this church, Laodicea, etc. He's actually speaking to them, but he's saying this is what you're missing. You're lukewarm. You're not following your first love. These are things that he's giving these messages, which God is basically the one speaking to him, and he's just
Right.
revealing what he's hearing. So it's like the revelation. Christ himself is giving this vision to him.
Right.
But it's like, you're seeing stuff that's like, wow, you got the 4
Yeah.
horsemen of the apocalypse, you've got, these bowls and these plagues, and you've got this wildness that is very difficult. Mark of the beast, those are things that, we kind of interpret out of it. Doesn't use it quite phrasing it like that. But that stuff is there. But if you look back in the book of Daniel, you'll see, in the Old Testament, some of the same exact imagery
Right.
too in other places. So it's not like these are just things that only are going to happen in one particular time and place,
Right.
but they are things that do happen, literally in reality, in time, but also they happen at different levels at different times.
Right.
A lot of times people are always like, oh, so-and-so is the Antichrist, whether
Well,
it's,
and the way you finish that chapter, again, this is what I liked about the book, is as painting a sort of cinematic narrative, is having read the book of Revelation, imagine telling someone what you just saw, like, the dictating of it. And so after you describe the vision he's having and him trying to understand what the meaning of all this is, you say, Prochorus placed a scroll before him, dipping the quill into ink. Quote, "Tell me what you saw," he said softly. "I will write it down." John exhaled shakily. He closed his eyes, allowing the remnants of the vision to settle. Then, his voice barely above a whisper, he spoke, "In the beginning, I heard a voice behind me like a trumpet." and it's like, what was that like? It's really hard to put yourself, what would have that been like? you're the right-hand man to St. John. You've seen these miracles. He just had this incredible vision. He's, at one point, it almost is like he's crawled up in the fetal position, trying to understand what's happening. He's moving from ecstasy to weeping. And then he's like gaining back his sober mind. And you're like, okay, what just happened? I'll write this down.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And that's why when we read it, we're like, okay, what did I just read here? Because it's so, some of it seems, quote, bizarre, but it's different levels, of reality, that you have to use different kinds of imagery, just, because you can't really describe God, first of all. I mean, totally,
Right.
It's what we call the apophatic,
Right.
relationship. It's like he's unknowable, uncircumscribable,
Right.
immortal. These are words that say that he's not limited. He's infinite. He's not finite.
Right.
And those are the ways that you have to use sometimes images, whether they're images of locusts or images of bulls or fire and things like that, horses, which people understand what those are.
Right.
And they know that also they can mean, symbolic things as well. So that's
Right.
one of the issues too. Sometimes people think, is it literal or symbolic? The answer is yes.
Exactly. Exactly.
Either or.
I just had somebody ask me, well, does the Orthodox Church think the Ark of Noah is literal or symbolic? And it's always, well, both.
Both and, yeah.
So then the next chapter, chapter 18, is the return to Ephesus and the gospel of love. And this is talking about St. John the Theologian's time after Patmos. This would be where he's composing the epistles, the gospel of John, and really has a devotional following and teaching there in Ephesus. And so you talk about a story regarding the lost youth, which again is something that I hadn't heard, but in a way, again, the way it spoke to me is I was a lost youth.
Right.
And the way it's the gospel of John, as I mentioned, it's like the gospel of John and then St. Maximus, the confessor, the cosmic mystery of Jesus Christ. These two things together are what like just put me over the edge. Is like, okay, it's true. And you describe a story about, again, St. John is doing all this work, local work, converting people. And there's a young boy that he himself baptized, who then ends up joining a gang of robbers and thieves up in the mountains around Ephesus. And he hears that one of these kids that he himself baptized, and you describe as he saw him being filled with light during the baptism, now doing debaucherous and horrible things. And so he, at a very old age, I mean, I would assume, tell me if I'm wrong, but the time he gets out of Patmos back to Ephesus, I mean, he'd have to be at least 80 years old. I mean, how long was he in Ephesus? Because it's believed he died somewhere between 95 to 100 years old, correct?
Right. Yeah, absolutely. So this is not too far from his end of his life.
Right.
So you're probably right to say at least 80, but I don't know, his exact age, but he's definitely up there.
And so this old man, you can imagine, at least in my mind, I'm depicting St. John with a staff and a very old man who has a following for him teaching and sharing the revelation of Christ. And he finds out about this young boy and he marches up into the hills, into the mountainside to go find this kid. And he gets up there, and the leader of the gang, I should find it real quick, how exactly you write it. Right here. At last he reached the hideout. The thieves saw him first emerging from the shadows with hands on their weapons, their faces hardened by a life of violence. John did not flinch. I seek one among you, he said. The leader of the band stepped forward, his lips curling into a sneer. Old man, you seek nothing but death. Or you seek nothing here but death. And John held his gaze. Then take my life, he said, but first bring me the one I seek. And this leads to eventually him spotting the kid on kind of the periphery. And then the kid recognizes who John is, and he takes off, right? He takes off. And this old man, again, picture, I would assume at least 80 years old, could be older, begins to try to run after the guy and eventually able to catch up. And the kid breaks down sobbing. And John tells him, look, I will take all your sins onto me. Just come back home. And it's like the perfect, again, it's the prodigal son, but actually out in history.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's, part of my life story right there too. Yeah, it's like God chases after us, it's like, through his disciples, through his word, through his apostles. And yeah, no matter, how bad we might be, even if we've been, on one side and then we end up going against him, betraying him like Peter, God says, do you love me? And he wants you to come back. And that's a part of the story really was moving to me, even writing it. I was just like, I just gonna stop a couple times because it was like so personal.
Right. No, I mean it is, and it's the stories like that, the stories of the lives of the saints. But here we have an incredible saint. This is Saint John the theologian. This is a unique saint. This is an apostolic saint, and just to see the devotion he had for one soul. Right, I'm 35 years old. Would I, run up to the mountainside and then chase after one person that I found, had fallen away from the flock? I don't know. That's something I need to question about myself. But the earnestness of St. John is symbolic of his life and his devotion towards the message. And that's one of the things that it's not a great apologetic in regards to rational, framework and articulation regarding philosophy. But the fact that all these people were martyred and none of them recanted on what they claimed or what they said they saw about Jesus. Again, it's not a great apologetic in an argument or debate, but as a believer, somebody trying to question and look at the humanness of all this stuff. I mean, can you give me a scenario, not you generally, but anybody, can you provide a historical scenario where people were willing to die for a lie, where people were willing to be tortured for a lie, where people were willing to, at old age, try to hunt down one soul that they baptized for a lie?
Yeah, and it is, like I said, it's the story of like the good shepherd and so forth and the prodigal son, but it is a good, when I remember even going to law school, studying, rules of evidence. That is actually a strong piece of evidence is when someone testifies against their interest. In other words, it's not in my interest to promote this gospel, because I mean, in the sense that I'm going to get killed if I don't just do what you tell me to do. So I'm going to go against, my physical life interests, but I'm going to do these things, and I'm not going to do it just for something that I don't believe in. And so back, your point there is a strong argument in logic for why would somebody do this for a lie, and the fact that so many people died, for this. And because it's also not just like one crazy person that did something that's like, okay, that person was totally crazy and
it's the apostles and all the students of the apostles.
Yeah, and people, and it's been, continuing the same story has been handed down, one to the other. So that's why I said St. John, he handed us to Polycarp, St. Ignatius, and many others continuing in these stories, the gospels they've lived. And we talked about, evidence, bibliographic evidence of the actual gospels in the writings. There's a lot more, even original documents, manuscripts of the Bible and the gospels and others than of many, even more modern, recent texts, whether it's, Shakespeare's or writings of Abraham Lincoln or somebody like that. So this has a lot, not just, logical evidence, but I think the main thing is that these stories, number one, they are true.
Right.
And number two, that, we can all actually relate if we have that, as you said, the front of the mindset of, a humble, open heart.
Right.
And just learn the lessons. What is the lesson I can learn from this?
Right. The next to last chapter is The Vanishing Saint, which talks about the repose of St. John. And what you outline is he kind of knew the day was coming, and uniquely he was gifted with old age in the sense that he actually had an intact mind. Some of us, I had a grandparent that got dementia. So sometimes they have a physical body, but they don't have a mind. And he was losing his physical body. And at this point, again, he's around 95 to 100 years old in the ancient period. This was a very old man. And sensing his time to come, he takes a few of his followers and they march up to a sort of ideal site, a place with the grass that's been untouched, and tells them to start digging in the ground, dig my grave, guys, and make it in the sign of a cross. and then they do that, and then he blesses them all. They give the goodbyes, and then he just gets down into the grave, and he asks them to start putting dirt onto him all the way up to his neck, and then he just takes his final breath and he reposes. I mean, what an incredible story.
Yeah, it is incredible. And that, like even as you're saying it, you could just visualize that like in a cinematic image. It's like, wow, okay, they're following him and he's okay right here, and they've got shovels and they're dig or whatever they have, but I mean
Right.
not real shovels, but sticks and
Yeah.
tools. And they and he buries, he gives himself to his burial up to that, and he says gives his last breath.
And the
And the
reason
last thing that he say to people too, just real quickly too, is like when the people were talking to him, you talk about his mind. The thing he would say it to everyone was, "Children love one another.
right.
Children
Yeah.
love one another."
He
He didn't need to
simplified
have
his
a bunch
message.
of complicated theology or let's, argue, the energy essence distinctions and all these different things, which they're true and we should discuss
Right.
them. But it's bottom line is okay, love one another.
Right. Yeah, and that's, you highlight that, and that's again one of the ironies, is that the Gospel of John is referred to as the theological gospel, because it has, not that it's better than any of the other three gospels, but it just has a different approach. It has a different layering of meaning in the way that it's laid out. But in this chapter, you then say that the people, I mean, they sit there, the guys, I imagine these are probably younger guys following St. John. He's laying there with dirt up to his neck. They think he's dead. Nobody's willing to say anything. Maybe an hour or two goes by in silence, and then they decide to go back down to the city. And then they tell the other followers, yeah, St. John, he's just reposed. And they're like, well, take me there. They end up taking him back to the gravesite, and what's left? Only his sandals. And that's why you titled it The Vanishing Saint.
Mm-hmm.
So so that motif then happens with Christ, the Theotokos, and St. John. Three instances of going back to the burial site and the reposed body not being there.
Right. 3 empty tombs.
Powerful. And then the last chapter, the Eagle's Flight, the Eternal Saint, kind of talks about the importance of John, and how, again, what you just described in brevity within the book is something that is transcending his lifetime. It is the impact of the Gospel of John and the epistles and the book of Revelation is an immediate connection back to this great saint. And as you mentioned with Polycarp, St. Irenaeus was the student of Polycarp, and it's from St. Irenaeus where we believe, through tradition, he claims that Polycarp, who was with St. John, wrote the book of Revelation, wrote the Gospel of John, and wrote the epistles. And so that's our sort of, I guess it'd be a secondhand witness, because he's claiming that's what Polycarp told him, who is claimed to be in there with John when he did these things.
Right.
So, yeah, I mean, and that's why that last chapter hit, because the Eternal Saint, it is what you call the flight of the eagle, the vision of the eagle soared beyond lands and ages, sweeping over the ruins of empires, the rise of new kingdoms, the prayers of saints who called upon his name. From the mountaintop of Athos to the gilded icons of Russia, from the illuminated manuscripts of Ireland to the fiery sermons of preachers who stood upon the wooden pulpits in distant lands, the voice of John has never been silenced. Yeah, I love that.
Amen. Yeah, I'm so appreciative of all his inspiration, from my own personal life, and as you were saying, to yours as well, and so many people's, that not just the Gospel of John, which is obviously probably the most well-known, and most people know, like, John 3:16,
Right,
if you know any verses at all, it's like, so God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son, whosoever believeth in him shall not perish but have everlasting life. And that's all. It says a lot right there.
Right.
I know a lot of times people will take that, and that's like their whole theology is just that one verse, which is obviously there's more to it than just believing that set of facts, but it's definitely encapsulates, like really the seed of the gospel, because that is what, God did, because he loved us so much that, he did give his son, and his son gave us life.
Right. Well, guys, if you have any quick questions or comments, it doesn't look like anybody sent anything in regarding the stream, but we did have one guy, Orthodox Russ. He says he went ahead and purchased your book, and he had a question for you, asking if I can ask you for the name of the monastery where you got the Life of the Holy Virgin. It was that book that you showed in the beginning. I think you mentioned it was a monastery in California.
No, it's in Colorado. It's
Oh,
called
Colorado.
yeah, it's Holy Apostles Convent in Buena Vista,
Oh, okay.
Colorado. And they do a lot of very scholarly works on their books. I can't vouch for, the whole monastery itself or, anything else other than their works, their books that they come out with. But I've definitely had them recommended, by people like, Father Peter and others who recommends them. And that's where I got that particular book. And it's really worth reading. It's amazing.
And again, everybody, if you are interested in getting this book, which I do recommend, and I'm going to have my wife read it because I think it's such a digestible read. Like some of the Orthodox works are a little bit difficult for somebody who's not that interested in the depth of theology and maybe some of the nuances, like some of the guys here, myself in the chat. But this is so digestible. I mean, it's so approachable by anybody can read this and get that, as you pointed, the cinematic narrative moving through this of these major events that we cherish as Christians, but getting a backstory that, a lot of us haven't heard of, even converts to Orthodoxy. And this is part of the Orthodox tradition. This is the bigger, as we said, to use that term again, phronema, perspective, worldview, paradigm of Orthodoxy and how it relates to the Mother of God, how it relates to an apostolic saint. And so I highly recommend everybody getting the read if you would like to. And I'm going to share that link in the live chat. Is there anything you want to say to anybody now and in the future watching this, John?
Well, yeah, the last thing is just, go back to, our, website, like the American Orthodox Film.com. And that's really the main thing I'm focusing on right now. This book, they just wrote, this one here. Yeah, I really hope people will read it and share it. And to me, it's like I write things like cinematically because I would like to see this. This could be like a movie in itself or some type of
Easily. Yeah,
adaptation, on some
yeah.
level. It would be probably beyond my ability, really to do it, to do it full justice. But if anyone if you watch, like, if you go to the, YouTube, American Orthodox, you see the trailer for the film that we did,
Yep, I
and
got that pulled up too.
go to our the website, the American Orthodox Film, and people who want to see the film, we are doing a lot of screenings right now, and it's free, for any parish that wants to see it. They can go, they can go to the website, contact us there, and then they can, I can send them the way to get that movie so they can see it at your parish, your school, different groups, church groups, etc. So that's the
Right.
biggest thing we're doing right now. So it's on, it's on YouTube, just the trailer, if you go to just look American Orthodox. And then there's also two other quick things. There's a Facebook page, which I'm not the administrator. My friend Christine's really good. She runs this page. It's called American Orthodox Documentary Film on Facebook. And so
Okay.
that gives a lot of updates and so forth. And same thing like with the YouTube channel. If you go to American Orthodox and, at least if you subscribe to, I'm going to be putting some more things up there on that page. And then the last thing I want to emphasize too, because that movie is really about Fort Ross and the saints that have walked among us. And, you've done some streams about that, is if you go to Fort Ross Pilgrimage, fortrosspilgrimage.org, there's my friend Robin and others who are part of the film. My friend Christine was one of my production assistants. And if you saw Sacred Alaska, the producer of Sacred Alaska is the cinematographer in, trying to see what you're looking at there.
I'm trying to pull up the
fortrosspilgrimage.org.
fortrosspilgrimage.org. There we go.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah. Yeah, I highly recommend, anyone who has never been there. That's how, the Orthodox Church came to California, back in 1812, which if anyone knows the 1812 overture, that actually begins the beginning of that piece by Tchaikovsky. It's actually the Troparion of the Cross, the beginning intro to that song or that piece. But anyway, Fort Ross pilgrimage is October 4th. Many people all over the world are coming there because it'll be the 100th anniversary of annual liturgies. We've been going to liturgies there since 1925. In the film, the American Orthodox film, it talks a lot about, it actually has some footage from those early uh, liturgies and visits by priests and bishops and other people. Many saints, 5 saints have gone there. St. Peter the Aleut is one of them. St. John of San Francisco, who many of us know, St. Sebastian, St. Innocent, St. Tikhon. So 5 saints actually have walked at this place, Fort Ross. So we have like this holy land here in California. It's in Northern California. And if anyone gets a chance, I highly recommend, you know, checking this out. There's going to be a conference on that day before in Santa Rosa, Northern California, and then all day on the 4th there'll be a liturgy, and there'll be a big, people from all over the world are going to come to this. And it was established like 200 years ago, literally 1825 was that chapel that you're seeing there in
Right.
the image there. So it's been 200 years there, and it's definitely a holy place. And anyone who's ever gets a chance to get out this way, I really want you to try to get there at least one time in your life.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a goal for my wife and I. We're going to keep the October 4th date open. We don't know, again, being in the Midwest, if we'll be able to get there, but I've already talked with her about it. If we can, we would like to attend that. That'd be a great experience. So again, everybody, I shared that link, fortrosspilgrimage.org. If you guys are interested and want to look further into this, they got information about conference information, lodging options, all types of stuff. So just check this out, use that link. And also, again, don't forget to support John regarding his book that we just covered, Beloved Disciple, Guardian of the Holy Virgin. And of course, if your parish or school is interested, American Orthodox documentary is available. They're still going through different film festivals, correct? So it won't be out for the general public for about another year. But if you're a church, you can message you and get a permission of some sort, a link to watch it together as a church or a parish, which is something that our men's group wants to do in the coming months. So that's a goal that our church also has. And you can watch that trailer at their YouTube channel right here, American Orthodox. I'm going to share that link with you guys as well.
Yeah, and anyone, I recommend some, even though I only have the trailer up there right now, I do have a couple of posts. If you click on the post part of it, that show some of the other channels that I've been part of, like yours and Kyle.
Kyle, absolutely.
Ancient Faith and others. So anyway, but I will be putting up some more content there too. So I really appreciate anyone who wants to come to that channel, as well as, like I said, the Facebook American Orthodox documentary film, just so they can, at least we can have contacts. And that's, I'm not really on big social media type of person. So
rightfully so. You mentioned that last time. I was like, you got any social media to share? You're like, I use
that's
email.
it. YouTube. Yeah, exactly. I have YouTube, and then there is a Facebook page, which I don't.
If you need to read to me, you can fax me.
Oh yeah, right. Yeah, so Western Union, Telegraph.
Looks like somebody sent in a question. Oh, thank you, Orthodox Rush just became a COTEL crew member. God bless you, brother. Loving the cowboy hat, my man.
Nice.
And Jordan Johnson says, my dad said I should read more, and I agree. So I'll pick up this book for sure. DPH, add this to a book list for the Logos Academy. Okay. Yeah, I can absolutely do. That'd be a good idea. I just launched. I talked to you about it. We actually talked backstage.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, it looks good. Yeah, you got over 100 members so far.
I've been really.
That's the future of education.
Yeah, I think we're going to be doing a group discussion next Wednesday, and I think for the first one, I'm just going to have everybody read the prologue of the Gospel of John, and then we get into a group. It's usually about 20 to 30 people in the Zoom meeting, and then we can just have a free for all. So
Yeah, no, I highly recommend people, especially young men who are really trying to get a little bit of community and focus in their lives. David Patrick is one of the better people out there on,
well,
that
thank
I
you.
know of. I know many, in
Yeah,
this
thank you, brother. I
space.
appreciate that. Yeah, we got some great,
Because
it's such it's a fun little endeavor because we're getting like young guys, 18, early 20s that are converting to the faith or they're in choirs. And then we got guys shout out to Jonathan Newby, who's a member. He's on the U.S. strongman team, and he'll be competing
oh,
on behalf of the U.S. In 2 weeks over in Ireland.
oh,
And
awesome,
so we have everything from like professional strength, strongmen, married men, older men, to young men that are trying to figure out their lives. And that's why by the way, it is a group for men. So this
right?
is a men's group, which you can't really have a lot. There's not many spaces for young men to engage with older men in a space where it's just men. And so
Yeah, and it's good.
just
I
within our
think there's a
first
need for
meeting,
that.
some of the conversation has been incredible. Just the wisdom from the older guys through life experience, talking to the young guys. So, Jordan, I will absolutely, I will work on putting a book list together for the Logos Academy, and I'll absolutely keep John's books on there, and also some other books, anything that I found important. So that's a great idea, Jordan. I'm going to do that.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
then he threw in $20 more, says, take my money.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you, Jordan. I
Yeah.
really appreciate that, my brother.
Yeah, and I want to encourage people too. Just what two quick points. One is not just like you were talking about, like getting in the community. Number of go to church and
Yes.
connect with your
Yes.
friends, your family, and people. Physical connections. Obviously online. There's a lot of information like what we're doing here, and I think it's good to encourage and to share and to be in a part in the Logos Academy and things like that. But also, I want to encourage people to actually read physical books
Yes.
more, because people are just we're in that culture where it's hard to even pay attention for like an hour at a time, or even 10 or 20 minutes, and just try to read something even out of whether it's in the Gospels or something on a daily basis. But also, I want to encourage people to create, to write. Not just not saying everybody's gonna be like a novelist or a writer, or a screenwriter per se, but there's a lot of very intelligent, very creative people out there, who are doing things like what you're doing here, creating channels. I mean, there's a lot of beautiful, filmmaker types of people, people who can make games, people who can write comic books, and not just, in the art, in all type music, like just like I was listening to the music, the intro music that you have. I mean, that's amazing. I love it, and I just think that people should use their talents, the gifts that
Yeah.
God has given us.
Shout
Don't
out.
bury them, as they say, but put them up on a
Yeah. Shout out to B
lampstand.
Dog. It's
Yeah,
actually an Orthodox gentleman out of Virginia.
yeah.
And he makes those. He'll take an Orthodox chant, and some people think we're desecrated. That's not the goal at all.
No, no,
Our
not at
goal
all.
is to just provide a new medium for young people to experience Orthodoxy. And
Right.
so,
It's like changing it into the language of changing, like from Slavonic or from Greek to English.
yeah,
There's a language that people, and it's not to desecrate it, it's to communicate it.
yes. And for people who complain about it, my priest knows about it. Multiple priests have been on the channel. I've had no clergy be upset about it. It's only usually young converts that claim I'm desecrating. It's like they just got into the church. I'm desecrating. I've had no clergy have a problem with it.
Right.
So yeah, the
That's
irony.
why that's why I say it. I know it's kind of ironic when I say it. Like I say, I'm not young enough to know everything. It's like, you get people that come in and it's like, okay, here's how everyone should be doing things the way I think they should be doing it. And it's like, okay, just take some time to listen for a while, learn, just, I mean, it's hard for me, I'm a big know-it-all. So, God forgive me for my big mouth.
Right. Well, John, thanks again for coming on. Thank you again for all your work. You guys get the book, Beloved Disciple, Guardian of the Holy Virgin. In all of John's books, I got the other 3 up here on my bookshelf. The guy's a prolific writer. He's constantly doing stuff.
Yeah. American Orthodox, start there.
Yeah. So God bless you and the family.
Thank you so
again
much.
for all your work.
You too.
Is there any?
Congratulations on
Thank
your PhD, Logos Academy, your lovely wife, and new growing family
yeah.
beginnings. And I just really wish you all the best, and all the people listening too. I want to thank you all for spending time here, and hope you share this with others.
Thank you very much, John.
Take
God
care.
bless you, brother, and all your work, and everybody out there. And I will be back potentially tomorrow or Sunday. I got a couple streams lined up. One is the history of Baal and Moloch worship. We're going to be diving into that. Another one is the biography of Saint Stephen the Great, Saint Ephraim, the relationship between Kabbalah and Protestantism. So these are all some streams that I'll be getting ready to do all the research for, and you can expect those potentially the first one tomorrow. I may need some more time researching, but Sunday and especially all next week. So I got tons of content for you guys. And if you want to be part of our men's community, go to school.com/Logos Academy. Next Wednesday, we'll be doing another think tank, and it's going to be themed on the prologue of the Gospel of John. Read it ahead of time, and then we're going to come together as a group of men and see what we get into and just open up for discussion. So if that's something you're interested in, please join the Academy. But thank you, John. Thanks for all your work. And I will see you guys in the next one. As always, until then, God bless.
Great. Thanks.